Welcome to the debate. Imagine spending 300 hours memorizing the exact fluid dynamics, the joint angles, and the breathing techniques of an Olympic swimmer.
Right, just studying the tape end to end.
Exactly. You study it, you understand the biomechanics perfectly, and you feel incredibly prepared. And then you jump into the deep end of the pool and, well, you immediately start drowning.
Because you've never actually swam before.
Right. Today, we are examining a really brutal reality about the human brain and how it acquires new skills. Our discussion is anchored in a piece of source material that presents this stark, unyielding thesis on accelerated learning. It basically says, stop consuming, start applying. You don't learn by watching, you learn by doing.
It's an incredibly provocative premise, honestly, because it attacks what most of us consider to be the very foundation of education. I mean, the text argues that the accumulation of information isn't just inefficient, it's actively holding us back.
It is. And I'm going to defend the position that execution is the sole indispensable mechanism for learning, and that information surplus is a hindrance.
And I'm going to argue that discarding observation and information consumption fundamentally misunderstands how foundational knowledge actually works.
So let's start with the central diagnosis the material makes about human behavior. I mean, the primary bottleneck for proficiency in almost any domain today is not a lack of data.
Right. We have plenty of data.
We are drowning in it. If you are listening to this right now, think about how many productivity newsletters you subscribe to. You probably feel incredibly productive reading them on Sunday morning over coffee, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a great feeling.
You feel like you are upgrading your mental software. But how many of those frameworks did you actually execute on Monday?
Probably zero.
Well, yeah. When we consume information, reading a business book, watching a carpentry tutorial, scrolling through a language app, our brain releases dopamine. It mimics the neurological reward of actual accomplishment.
You feel like you climbed the mountain just because you bought the map.
Yes, precisely. But the text is pointing out an epistemological truth, like a fundamental reality about how we actually know what we know. Theoretical knowledge just cannot replicate the physical, cognitive, or emotional friction of real-world application.
Okay, look, the dopamine trap is real. I'll give you that. But your diagnosis kind of throws the baby out with the bathwater here.
How so?
Well, you're talking about people who binge newsletters and do nothing. Let's separate the abuse of a tool from the actual utility of the tool. The material treats information intake and execution as if they are mutually exclusive enemies.
Because in practice, they often are.
But severing the intake of information entirely removes the conceptual framework required to actually do anything effectively. Like if I want to learn how to code a neural network, and I just start typing random syntax into a compiler, which is pure execution, I am going to get nothing but error messages for a millennium.
That's a bit of an exaggeration, but go on.
It's true. I have to consume the syntax rules, the mathematical frameworks, and, the logic structures that others have already figured out. Consumption is what calibrates the execution.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on what the brain is actually doing there. You are conflating conceptual memory with procedural memory. They are two totally different biological processes.
I wouldn't say totally different.
They are. Conceptual memory is knowing about the code. Procedural memory is the actual rewiring of the brain to perform the skill under pressure. When people say they are learning by reading about a skill, they are actually just practicing the skill of reading.
But the conceptual memory it's the prerequisite for the procedural memory to have any direction at all. Think about training a self-driving car algorithm.
Okay.
You can't just put a blank AI into a physical car, put it on a highway and say, learn by doing. It will immediately crash into a wall, and the learning stops right there.
Sure.
You have to feed it millions of lines of code, traffic laws, edge case parameters first. You have to let it consume the rules of the road.
So your self-driving car analogy actually proves my point.
How?
Because you can feed that algorithm all the code in the world, you can give it the perfect conceptual map, but until you put it into a simulation where there's friction, random weather variables, unpredictable pedestrians, it doesn't know how to drive. The code doesn't teach the algorithm to react. The friction does.
But without the code, it doesn't even know it's a car.
Let's bring it back to human biology. Think about Olympic weightlifting, specifically the snatch. It is an incredibly complex, highly technical physical movement.
Ah, yeah. Brutally difficult.
Right. You can hand a novice the most detailed biomechanics textbook in the world. They can memorize the exact joint angles, the velocity equations, the precise moment of hip extension.
Sure.
But when you put a heavy barbell in their hands, they will fail. Why? Because you cannot memorize the proprioceptive feeling of the barbell shifting off center. Proprioception, that literal physical awareness of where your body is in space, only develops when gravity tries to pull you down and your nervous system has to fight back.
Okay, but
The textbook doesn't teach the central nervous system. The weight does. The execution is the learning.
your weightlifting analogy actually proves my point, though.
I highly doubt that.
Think about it. If you don't consume the information that the goal is to get the bar from the floor to overhead in one continuous motion, your execution might just be kicking the barbell across the floor.
That's absurd.
It's true. Yes, the nervous system adapts to the weight. Yes, proprioception requires the physical barbell, but the conceptual map, the consumption, told the novice which direction to pull.
But knowing the direction to pull is entirely useless if the nervous system hasn't adapted to the load. And this is exactly what the source material is attacking when it says, you don't learn by watching, you learn by doing.
Right, and that's the part I struggle with most.
When you watch someone perform that Olympic lift, you are a passive observer. You aren't experiencing gravity.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Go for it.
The idea that watching this a purely passive state contradicts decades of cognitive science. Observation is a deeply active cognitive process. Have you ever watched a master craftsman work?
Of course.
When a novice watches a master carpenter angle a chisel, they aren't just passively recording video in their brain. They are engaging in vicarious learning. Our brains are equipped with mirror neurons.
Oh, the mirror neuron argument.
Yes, these neurons literally simulate the action we are observing as if we were performing it ourselves. By watching the master, the novice absorbs implicit heuristics, the subtle rhythm of the hammer, the tension in the wrist.
But they don't feel the tension.
They simulate it. These are micro-adjustments too complex to write down in a manual. Watching prevents catastrophic failure when the novice finally picks up the tools. If you don't learn by watching, why do surgical residents spend years observing operations before they make their first independent incision?
Because of liability, mostly.
No, it's because watching builds the pattern recognition required to execute safely.
They spend years watching, sure, but ask any chief of surgery when that resident actually learned to perform an appendectomy. They won't point to the observation deck.
Well, they wouldn't discount it either.
They will point to the exact moment the resident held the scalpel and felt the resistance of human tissue for the first time. The watching was preparation, maybe, but the learning, the actual biological adaptation, was the doing. Let me explain the exact mechanism of why that is.
Okay, let's hear it.
We talked about neuroplasticity earlier. When you watch a surgeon or when you read a book, you feel comfortable. There's no risk. But when you hold the scalpel or when you fail a heavy lift, you feel a massive spike of intense frustration and agitation.
Right, the stress response.
Exactly. But it's not just stress, it's the chemical trigger for learning. When you feel that intense frustration from failing, your brain releases epinephrine to make you hyper alert. More importantly, it releases acetylcholine.
The biological highlighter pen.
Exactly. It acts like a highlighter inside your brain. It literally marks the exact neural circuits that caused the failure, signaling to the brain, rewire these specific connections so we don't fail next time.
Sure, the mechanism is sound.
Reading a book or watching a video doesn't trigger that chemical cocktail. You bypass the agitation, which means you bypass the acetylcholine release, which means your brain does not change. So when the text says start applying, it is literally demanding that you enter that state of chemical agitation. That is the only way you learn faster.
Look, I don't dispute the neuroscience of neuroplasticity. The friction is where the myelin sheath grows thicker, making the neural pathways faster. But you are dismissing the quality of the action.
Quality comes from reps.
No, quality comes from understanding. If you don't have pattern recognition built through observation, that chemical cocktail of epinephrine and acetylcholine is just going to hardwire bad habits. You'll just become highly efficient at doing the wrong thing.
I disagree. Reality corrects you.
Much. It says, stop consuming, period.
If we take this stark command literally, it limits one's execution to pure, unadulterated trial and error.
And trial and error is the mechanism of truth. Reality gives you empirical feedback.
Trial and error is essential when you are on the bleeding edge of human knowledge, sure, discovering something no one has ever known. But for 99% of human endeavors, the wheel has already been invented.
So we should just read about wheels?
No, but stop consuming means refusing to look at the blueprints of the wheel. It forces you to spend 10 years figuring out the principles of aerodynamics by jumping off your roof and breaking your legs, instead of spending 1 week consuming the Wright brothers' data and then building a functional plane.
Okay, that's a bit extreme.
It's the logical conclusion of the text. Conceptual clarity requires consuming the frameworks built by others. The refusal to consume isn't brave, it's arrogant.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. I don't read stop consuming as a command to undergo a lobotomy and ignore all human history.
Then what is it?
I read it as a necessary behavioral circuit breaker. Think about a ship that is listing dangerously to the starboard side. To right the ship, you don't just pull the steering wheel to the center, you have to pull it hard to port.
You have to overcorrect.
You have to overcorrect. Our modern intellectual environment is heavily weighted toward endless consumption. We are inundated with podcasts, articles, video essays, and social media threads that masquerade as education.
That is fair. The noise is deafening.
The intake valve is stuck wide open, and the output valve is rusted shut. In that context, a gentle suggestion to balance your time isn't going to work. Stop consuming is an overcorrection designed to force the shift. By shutting off the intake valve entirely, even temporarily, you starve the brain of its cheap dopamine. You leave it with only one avenue for stimulation: action.
I understand the necessity of a circuit breaker, I do. But let's talk about the collateral damage of that specific overcorrection. When we tell people to just start applying without consuming, we often see a tremendous waste of resources, time, and human potential.
Like what?
We see ambitious entrepreneurs launching businesses without understanding basic unit economics. They burn through their life savings because they thought execution and hustle were all that mattered.
Well, they learn eventually.
Yeah, when they're bankrupt. We see amateur athletes destroying their joints because they decided to just do heavy deadlifts without consuming any literature on spinal mechanics. The text says most people don't need more information. I counter that most people actually have the wrong information or superficial information.
Which is why they need to act, to find out what's real.
No, what they need is deep, high-quality consumption, followed by rigorous execution. The danger of the execution-only mindset is that it frequently produces highly motivated, highly active fools. They are running incredibly fast, but they are sprinting in the wrong direction.
But even sprinting in the wrong direction provides a higher quality of data than standing still and studying a map. If you run in the wrong direction, you eventually hit a wall. You experience the friction.
A very painful wall.
Yes, but reality forces you to update your model. You learn, viscerally, that it was the wrong direction. The person studying the map might spend 10 years debating whether the map is drawn to scale, never taking a single step. The application itself generates a superior, bespoke form of information that cannot be consumed from an external source. It generates empirical feedback.
At an incredibly high cost, though.
Yes, but it's the only cost that buys actual proficiency. When the text says they need more execution, it is recognizing that execution is the ultimate filtering mechanism for truth.
Okay, but
You can consume 10 different theories on how to manage a team of employees. They all sound perfectly plausible in some fancy business article. But the moment you actually have to execute, the moment you sit across the table from a defensive, underperforming employee, 9 of those theories evaporate upon contact with human emotion. The execution reveals what is real and what is just intellectual noise.
reality is the final arbiter. I won't argue that. But let's look at the emotional toll of that crucible. Learning through pure execution, through constant failure and adjustment, without a conceptual safety net, requires an immense amount of psychological resilience.
Which people should develop.
But most people quit when they hit that wall.
Consumption, watching a master, reading a detailed breakdown of the process, understanding the historical context of the skill provides the psychological scaffolding to survive the failures of execution.
I think it just gives them an excuse to delay.
Not true. When you know why you are failing, because you consumed the theory behind the practice, you can adjust your next attempt rationally. If you are just failing blindly because you refuse to consume any guidance, that isn't a learning process. That is just suffering.
Suffering is part of the process.
And human beings don't learn well when they are just suffering. They shut down. The cognitive load becomes too high, panic sets in, and the neuroplasticity you praised earlier grinds to a halt because the brain shifts entirely into survival mode.
Well, I think that depends entirely on how we frame the failure. If you view failure as a negative outcome, then yes, blind execution feels like suffering. But if you view failure as the literal mechanism of data gathering, it completely changes the paradigm.
That's a big if for most people.
But the source material is trying to build a different kind of resilience, the resilience of the scientist. A scientist doesn't cry when an experiment fails. The failure is the data. The problem with relying too heavily on your psychological scaffolding of theory is that it makes you fragile.
Fragile. How?
You expect the real world to behave like the textbook. When it doesn't, you freeze. The person who prioritizes execution over consumption expects chaos. They are adapted to the messiness of the real world because they never left it.
But the best scientists in the world don't just run random experiments. They conduct thorough literature reviews first.
To a point.
No, they consume everything published in their field, so they don't waste time testing a hypothesis that was debunked 20 years ago. I am not defending passive, endless consumption as a substitute for action. I agree that hoarding blueprints without building the house is a modern pathology.
Well, at least we agree on that.
But I am defending the vital symbiotic relationship between the two. The map is not the territory, but venturing into dangerous, complex territory without a map is hubris. The fastest learners in the world, whether they are chess grandmasters, elite athletes, or brilliant scientists, are characterized by an obsessive loop.
An execution loop.
A consumption and execution loop. They consume vast amounts of information to understand the frontier of their field, and then they execute fiercely at that frontier to push it further. They use consumption to aim and execution to fire.
We are circling the fundamental core of how human beings interact with reality here. Let's look at where we ultimately stand on this. I maintain that the path to accelerated learning is unavoidably paved by direct application, and that the source material's directive is exactly what the modern mind needs.
Despite the absolute wording.
Because of the absolute wording, we are paralyzed by an overabundance of information. We trick ourselves into feeling productive by consuming more data, while our actual capacity to perform atrophies. The directive to stop consuming and start applying is an urgent intervention.
An overcorrection.
Yes, one that forces us out of the comfortable illusion of theoretical competence and into the harsh, transformative reality of empirical feedback. The friction of doing is the only thing that actually rewires the brain.
And I maintain that while execution is undeniably the engine of progress, watching and consuming are the steering wheel. You cannot effectively learn by doing if you are applying fundamentally flawed logic due to a lack of foundational information.
Even if that information is just theory.
Yes, the absolute eradication of observation limits human potential to the slow, painful process of reinventing the wheel. Deep consumption calibrates the mind, activates pattern recognition, and ensures that when you finally do take action, that action is purposeful rather than random.
But we certainly share a convergence on the ultimate goal. Neither of us believes that mastery can be achieved from the armchair. Theory without practice is sterile.
Absolutely. The tension is entirely about the sequence and the ratio. I see consumption as the essential prerequisite that makes the doing effective, whereas the text and your position frames it as a potential trap that delays the necessary struggle.
Which leaves the listener with a profound question about their own daily habits. Take a hard look at your bookshelf, your podcast queue, your saved tutorial videos. Are you genuinely preparing to act, or are you just hiding in the comfortable library of endless information?
It's a tough mirror to look into.
We have to decide when it's time to put the blueprints down.
Because at the end of the day, you can study the physics of the water, you can memorize the mechanics of the stroke, and you can stand on the edge of the pool until you know everything there is to know about swimming. But sooner or later, you still have to jump into the cold water.